In a world where the color of your skin still determines how you're treated, nowhere is this more evident than in the confined spaces of modern air travel, where prejudice finds no escape route and justice has a long memory. "Sir," he said, voice gruff, "I'm going to need you to step aside." President Traore paused for only a moment. "Is there a problem?" "First-class boarding only right now. You need to wait." President Traore calmly reached into his blazer and produced his boarding pass. The first-class ticket gleamed under the light. But Trevor didn't even look at it. He took it from his hand, gave it a cursory glance, then slipped it into his pocket. He raised an eyebrow. "I'd like that returned." Trevor stepped closer. "You in a rush to get somewhere, buddy?" The word hit like a slap. A second flight attendant, a younger woman named Riley, shifted nervously by the galley. She clearly recognized the tension but said nothing, just watched. "I need to take my seat," President Traore said firmly. "Then you'll follow my procedure." Trevor snapped. "And that includes random security checks. Let's go." He didn't give him time to respond. With one heavy hand on his upper arm, he steered him away from the boarding area, past the cockpit, into a small crew preparation area just beyond the galley. The air inside was cool and still. There was a fold-down seat in the corner, a rolling cart of service equipment, and a pair of scissors sitting idle on a shelf. President Traore's heart thudded once in his chest. "I don't consent to this," he said clearly. "You have no legal cause to detain me." "You're acting suspicious," Trevor replied, motioning to the seat. "Sit down." He didn't move. Trevor leaned in close. "You think that first-class ticket means something? Not on my flight. Not to me." In an instant, two other crew members entered the space. One of them, a man in his 30s with a shaved head and nervous eyes, grabbed his left wrist. Another held the other side of the chair. President Traore's voice rose. "This is a violation. I want your names." But no one answered. Instead, Trevor grabbed the scissors. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Standard protocol," Trevor said. "You could be hiding something in that bag." President Traore tried to rise, but a sharp grip pushed him back down. Trevor unzipped his leather briefcase and began rummaging through his personal items. His diplomatic notes, his official documents, his medication. He pulled out a small decorative pin with an attached emblem, a gift representing his nation's highest honor, and held it up. "What's this for?" Trevor demanded. "It's a national emblem," President Traore said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Looks like it could be used as a weapon." He took the scissors and cut through the delicate fabric of the emblem, then snipped the metal pin in half. His breath caught in his throat. But he didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't even blink. He sat there as his dignity was stripped from him, watching pieces of a national symbol fall to the floor, like fragments of his country's heritage being torn away. Laughter echoed from one of the crew. "Just following protocol," he muttered. "Should have come in here with some respect," Trevor said, wiping scissors against his sleeve. "Now we can proceed properly." President Traore's fists clenched in his lap, the skin over his knuckles pale. But his voice, when it returned, was steady. "You'll regret this." Trevor leaned down, sneering. "People like you always say that." And then, just as quickly as it began, it ended. Trevor opened the door and gestured toward the cabin. "You're free to go. First class is that way," he said mockingly. President Traore rose slowly, hands trembling only slightly. He took his boarding pass back from Trevor's pocket without asking and walked out into the main cabin. His steps were even, his expression unreadable. But in his chest, something burned hotter than rage, deeper than humiliation. It was purpose. And in just a few minutes, that purpose would change everything. Because what Trevor didn't know was this: he wasn't there as a tourist. He wasn't there for leisure. He wasn't there as just another passenger. He was the president of an African nation traveling incognito, and he was about to witness firsthand exactly what had been alleged about discrimination on American airlines. The scissors' metallic click echoed in his ears long after he left that cold, cramped space. Every step he took toward his seat felt heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because of fury held in check. The remains of his nation's emblem still lay discarded in that crew room, decades of national history and cultural significance dismissed as potential contraband. The silence in the aisle felt suffocating. President Traoré passed two passengers who looked at him, then quickly looked away. They had heard, maybe they had even seen, but not one of them had spoken up. He didn't stop walking. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. At the front of the cabin, a low hum of voices filtered throughout first class. It was a high-profile flight. Several executives from the airline's corporate office were on board. National press covering their new international routes. Heavy media presence. President Traoré was supposed to blend in, observe discreetly. His international trade agreements waiting back in his capital. Staff prepped. Evidence being gathered. Diplomatic decorum preserved. But today that plan didn't matter. He stopped at his assigned seat, took a deep breath, then settled into it with deliberate slowness. The cabin stilled instantly. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Heads turned, and then recognition began to ripple, not of his identity, but of his presence. The man they had watched be escorted through the cabin like a security threat was now seated in first class. His leather briefcase, rifled through and hastily repacked, sat heavy on his lap. Some passengers stared in confusion, others in disbelief. From the galley, Trevor was watching, his face a mask of professional indifference that didn't quite reach his eyes. President Traoré placed his briefcase under the seat in front of him and turned slowly to face the window. His face was calm, cold even, the kind of calm that comes not from peace but from precision. Someone near the business section dropped a magazine. The flight attendant, the same man who had held the scissors, was now serving pre-flight drinks. When he made eye contact with President Traoré, he went absolutely still. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The blood drained from his face. President Traoré didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for the airline's safety card, studying it with exaggerated care. He didn't wait for service. He didn't ask for assistance. He simply sat, one slow breath at a time. A different flight attendant approached. Riley, the one who had witnessed everything without intervening.
"Can I get you anything before takeoff?"
she asked, voice cracking. "Water, please," President Traoré said. "And your name for my records." Riley's hand shook as she poured the water. "Riley Evans." "Sir." President Traoré nodded once, then took the offered glass, the liquid trembling slightly as turbulence from the taxiing aircraft vibrated through the cabin. He looked straight ahead. His gaze never touched the man who had humiliated him. Not yet. Not directly. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom.
"Ladies and gentlemen,
welcome aboard. Flight 2207 to Chicago O'Hare. We're currently number 3 for takeoff and should be airborne in just a few minutes." A chorus of seatbelt clicks followed, passengers settling in as if nothing unusual had happened. Some were engrossed in tablets, others already dozing off. From across the aisle, a man in an expensive suit kept glancing his way, his expression a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. President Traoré ignored them all. The plane accelerated down the runway, engines roaring as steel and aluminum defied gravity. They climbed steadily into the morning sky, the ground falling away beneath them. From the corner of his eye, he saw Trevor slowly moving through the cabin, distributing hot towels to first-class passengers. His hands were steady, but his face betrayed a nervousness that hadn't been there before. His legs shifted restlessly as he worked. He looked like he wanted to disappear, like he knew deep in his gut that his moment was coming. He was right. After reaching cruising altitude, the captain turned off the seatbelt sign. The first round of drink service began. President Traoré stayed seated, watching as Trevor carefully avoided his section, assigning Riley to serve his row instead. When Riley approached with the drink cart, President Traoré finally spoke again. "Ms. Evans, I'd like to speak with the lead flight attendant. Please." Riley's face paled. "That would be Trevor." "Sir, then please inform Trevor I'd like to speak with him. He's very busy with service right now." President Traoré's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Tell him President Traoré would like a word." The effect was immediate. Riley's eyes widened in recognition, then horror. "President, now, please." She obeyed, moving quickly to the galley where Trevor was arranging glasses. Their whispered exchange was intense but brief. Trevor's head snapped up, his eyes finding President Traore across the cabin. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, like a man walking toward his execution, he approached his seat. "You requested to see me." His voice was professional but strained. President Traore motioned to the empty seat beside him. "Sit down, Mr. Linden." His mouth opened. "I'm on duty. I can't—" That wasn't a request. He blinked, then slowly lowered himself into the seat. "State your full name for the record." He shifted nervously. "Excuse me, you heard me. Trevor James Linden. How long have you served as a flight attendant with this airline?" 17 years. He tapped a finger against his armrest. Once, twice, then he leaned forward. "And in those 17 years, how many passengers have you assaulted in that preparation area?" The color drained from Trevor's face. "Mr. President, I didn't know." "That's not what I asked." He looked around for help. None came. "How many complaints have been filed against you, Mr. Linden?" I'm not sure." President Traore's voice rose, not in volume but in precision. 23. 23 formal complaints, all buried, all dismissed, because you hid behind procedure and protocol. His mouth trembled. "I didn't know who you were. I thought—" "And that's the problem, isn't it?" he snapped, his voice cracking the stillness. "You thought I was no one. Just another black man you could bully, violate, humiliate for sport." The row around them was dead silent. Passengers pretended to look elsewhere, but everyone was listening. "You didn't even bother to ask for my name." Trevor tried to speak, but no sound came. President Traore leaned in closer. "Because of you, this aircraft, this supposed vessel of public accommodation, has been stained. Because of your actions, the safety of passengers is now under question. And because you assaulted a head of state during an official diplomatic visit, you are now the subject of an international incident." He turned to look over his shoulder, gesturing toward two men in plain clothes who had been seated in business class. Effective immediately, the men rose, security personnel who had been traveling with the president. They moved with quiet efficiency toward the front of the plane. "No, wait, Trevor stammered. "You can't do this." But he was wrong. President Traore already had— The cabin didn't feel like a normal flight anymore, not after what had just happened. Trevor Linden, once a fixture of control and intimidation on these routes, was now seated in the back row, flanked by security personnel, his airline wings removed, his authority stripped, but the aftershock still lingered. It was in the silence, in the way the engines hummed a little too loudly, in the sidelong glances shared between crew members who had known for years and said nothing. President Traore sat back in his seat, fingers laced together on his lap, his presence now unmistakable. There was no going back to the way things were before, and truthfully, he didn't want to, because something had shifted, not just inside him, but inside the entire aircraft. Riley approached cautiously, holding a tablet. "Mr. President," she said quietly, "the captain would like to speak with you when it's convenient." President Traore nodded. "How long until we land?" "About 2 hours." President Traore looked past her, out into the now tense cabin. Rows of passengers, some pretending to sleep, others watching with undisguised interest. But he could still feel Trevor's presence like an oil stain on polished metal. He exhaled slowly. This flight had already defied every expectation, and they were only at the halfway point. From the galley, a young flight attendant approached. Male, maybe early 20s. Name tag reading Marcus. Serious expression. Never making eye contact unless necessary. He looked troubled. President Traore gave a small nod. "Everything okay?" Marcus hesitated. Then he leaned down and spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to say I saw it. What happened with Mr. Linden at boarding? I didn't know what to do. I should have said something. I was scared." President Traore didn't answer right away. He just studied the young man's trembling hands. Then he said gently, "Thank you for telling me. That matters. I didn't stop it." "No," President Traore replied. "But you're speaking now. That's more than most." Marcus looked like he might collapse with the weight of his guilt. But he straightened his shoulders and added, If you need me to testify about this, or the other incidents, I will. President Traoré reached across the armrest and placed a hand over his ear. Just for a moment. No words, just acknowledgement. Then the cabin intercom chimed. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been cleared for our initial approach into Chicago. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for arrival. The crew moved with a new kind of precision, their usual banter absent. Even the passengers seemed to sense the shift. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It was evidence. As the aircraft began its descent, the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. Subtly, sharply, the power dynamics were no longer in question. This wasn't just air travel anymore. It was a reckoning. During final approach, a passenger seated 2 rows behind President Traoré caught his attention. An older black man, mid-60s, elegant but weary, hands clasped tightly in his lap. Their eyes met briefly, and the man nodded, a silent gesture of recognition and gratitude. When the wheels touched down at O'Hare, the usual post-landing bustle was muted. Nobody rushed to stand. Nobody pushed toward the exits. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, passengers rose with unusual care, as if the air itself had become fragile. President Traoré remained seated, watching as Trevor was escorted from the aircraft first. Before any other passengers disembarked, the airline's ground staff waited at the gate, looking grim-faced and uncertain. Among them stood a tall woman in a crisp suit, the airline's chief executive officer, already preparing damage control for what was about to unfold. Only when the last passenger had filed past his seat did President Traoré finally rise. Riley stood nearby, pale but determined. President Traoré absorbed this information without visible reaction. But inside, puzzle pieces were falling into place. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was pattern and practice. As President Traoré stepped from the aircraft, the jetway felt longer than usual. At the end of it, beyond the gate area, a small group of people waited. His diplomatic staff, representatives from the State Department, reporters ready to document everything while it was still fresh. But before he reached them, President Traoré paused and turned to Riley, who had followed him out. "Miss Evans," he said, his voice professional but not unkind, "you'll be receiving a formal diplomatic inquiry by tomorrow morning. Prepare accordingly." The terminal was busy, but a strange pocket of stillness surrounded President Traoré as he walked. Perhaps it was his posture, or the intensity in his eyes, or the way the airline staff seemed to visibly shrink as he passed. As they reached the airport exit, President Traoré finally allowed himself a deep breath. Not out of relief, but resolve. Today wasn't over, not even close. Because the world may have seen Trevor Linden fall, but they hadn't seen what came next. And the real reckoning was still to come. The car waiting to take him to the embassy was already running, its driver standing at attention as he approached. Chicago's skyline loomed in the distance, stark against the morning sky. The diplomatic meeting would be full when he arrived, but it wouldn't be the same meeting anymore. Something unspoken had shifted. It hung in the air like a promise, like a warning, like justice too long deferred, finally demanding to be served. And this time, there would be no place for them to hide.